What started as a simple birthday trip to visit Grandma would become a defining moment that changed not just one family's life, but an entire industry's approach to equality and justice. Sarah Johnson thought she knew what to expect when she boarded the first-class cabin with her 3-year-old daughter Emma. After all, her husband Michael was the pilot flying them to Chicago that morning. The seats were properly reserved, the boarding passes were valid, and this should have been just another routine family flight. But sometimes the most ordinary moments reveal the most extraordinary truths about who we are as a society and who we can choose to become. What happened next in that first-class cabin would test Sarah's grace under pressure, challenge a flight attendant's deepest assumptions, rally strangers to stand up for what's right, and ultimately transform personal pain into systematic change that would protect thousands of families for years to come. This is the story of how one mother's refusal to accept injustice turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for transformation, proving that sometimes the most powerful turbulence happens not in the skies, but in the human heart. Fasten your seatbelts. This journey will take you higher than you ever imagined. Sarah Johnson adjusted the straps of her designer handbag and glanced down at her 3-year-old daughter, Emma, who was clutching a worn teddy bear with one missing eye. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to and catch flights, but Sarah felt a familiar calm wash over her. After 15 years of marriage to Captain Michael Johnson, airports had become as familiar to her as her own living room. "Mommy, are we going to see Daddy fly the big airplane?" Emma asked, her bright eyes sparkling with excitement. Sarah smiled and smoothed down Emma's curly hair, which had inherited the perfect blend of her own texture and Michael's color. "Yes, sweetheart, Daddy is flying us to Grandma's house today." The announcement for first-class boarding echoed through Gate 12, and Sarah gathered their carry-on bags. She had done this routine hundreds of times before. The perks of being married to one of the airline's most senior pilots included priority boarding and upgrades. Michael had specifically arranged for them to be in first class today, since it was Emma's birthday trip to visit his mother in Chicago. As they approached the boarding gate, Sarah noticed the usual mix of business travelers and families. She recognized some of the flight crew members from previous flights, including the lead flight attendant, Jennifer Williams, a blonde woman in her 40s, who had always been professional, if a bit cold. During their previous encounters, Sarah presented their boarding passes to the gate agent, who smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. Captain Johnson wanted me to let you know he's already completed his pre-flight checks and is looking forward to seeing you both after takeoff." "Thank you, David." Emma's been talking about this trip for weeks. Sarah picked up Emma as they made their way down the jet bridge. The morning had started perfectly. Michael had left early for his pre-flight briefing, kissing both Sarah and Emma goodbye before heading to the airport. Sarah had taken her time getting ready, choosing a comfortable but elegant navy blue dress and flats that would be practical for traveling with a toddler. Her natural hair was styled in a professional updo, and she wore minimal makeup, just enough to feel put together for the flight. As they entered the aircraft, Sarah could see Michael through the open cockpit door, going through his final preparations. With his co-pilot, he caught her eye and winked, mouthing, "I love you," before returning to his instruments. Emma giggled and waved enthusiastically at her father. The first-class cabin was spacious and welcoming, with only a few other passengers settling into their seats. Sarah found their assigned seats, 2A and 2B, and began the familiar ritual of getting Emma comfortable for the flight. She pulled out the iPad loaded with Emma's favorite movies, a coloring book, and some snacks. "Can I color the airplane picture for Daddy?" Emma asked, pointing to a drawing in her coloring book that looked remarkably similar to the Boeing 737 they were currently boarding. "Of course, baby. Daddy will love that." Sarah helped Emma get settled with her crayons while she organized their belongings in the overhead compartment. The atmosphere in first class was typically serene, with soft lighting and the gentle hum of passengers finding their seats. Sarah had always appreciated how smoothly these flights went when Michael was the captain. There was something reassuring about knowing your husband was in control of the aircraft, carrying your precious cargo. As more passengers began boarding, Sarah noticed Jennifer Williams moving efficiently through the cabin, checking on first-class passengers and ensuring everything was in order. Jennifer had been with the airline for nearly 20 years and had a reputation for running a tight ship. Sarah had interacted with her on several occasions and found her to be competent, though she often seemed stressed and overwhelmed by the demands of her job. "Mommy, when will we be in the clouds?" Emma asked, pressing her face against the window. "To watch the ground crew loading luggage." "Very soon, sweetheart. Daddy will make sure we have a smooth ride up to see the clouds." Sarah buckled Emma's seatbelt and adjusted her own, feeling the familiar anticipation that came with any flight. The boarding process continued around them, and Sarah could hear the usual sounds of passengers finding seats, stowing luggage, and settling in for the journey. She opened a book she had been looking forward to reading, a novel her book club had selected about resilience and second chances. It seemed fitting for this trip as they were traveling to celebrate not just Emma's birthday, but also Michael's recent promotion to senior captain. Life had been good to the Johnson family. Sarah's career as a pediatric nurse had flourished at the children's hospital where she worked, and Michael's dedication to aviation had earned him recognition as one of the airline's most reliable and skilled pilots. They had built a comfortable life together filled with love, laughter, and the shared joy of raising Emma. As Sarah settled into her seat and watched Emma carefully color her airplane picture, she felt grateful for the ordinary magic of family life. These simple moments, traveling together, sharing quiet conversations, watching their daughter discover the world, were the treasures that made everything else worthwhile. The last few passengers were boarding now, and Sarah could sense the familiar shift in energy that signaled the flight would soon be ready for departure. She glanced toward the cockpit again and saw Michael reviewing final paperwork with his co-pilot, his focused expression reflecting the professional expertise that had made him such a respected pilot. Everything seemed perfect for what should have been a routine family flight to Chicago. Jennifer Williams had been having one of those mornings that seemed determined to go wrong from the very beginning. Her alarm had failed to go off, causing her to rush through her morning routine. Traffic had been unusually heavy on her way to the airport, and she had arrived at the crew briefing with barely a minute to spare. The operations manager had then informed her that 2 of her junior flight attendants had called in sick, leaving her short-staffed for what was expected to be a full flight. As she moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers and ensuring everything was properly arranged, Jennifer's stress level continued to climb. She prided herself on maintaining the highest standards of service, but today felt like an uphill battle against circumstances beyond her control. She noticed the young black woman in seat 2A with her small daughter and paused. Jennifer had been with the airline long enough to recognize certain patterns, and something about this situation struck her as odd. The woman was well-dressed and seemed comfortable in first class, but Jennifer couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "Excuse me," Jennifer said, approaching Sarah with a professional but strained smile. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" Sarah looked up from helping Emma with her coloring book, slightly surprised by the request. She had already shown her boarding passes at the gate and to the passenger service agent when they boarded. "Of course," she said pleasantly, reaching into her purse. Jennifer examined the boarding passes carefully, her frown deepening as she studied them. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to need to verify these with the gate agent. There seems to be some confusion about your seat assignments." "I'm sorry, what kind of confusion?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining calm, but with a note of concern creeping in. Emma looked up from her coloring, sensing the change in atmosphere Well, these seats were specifically reserved for the captain's family members. I need to make sure there hasn't been a mistake with the seating assignments." Jennifer's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm, but she maintained her composure. "I can assure you there's no mistake. My husband made these reservations himself." Jennifer's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Your husband? And who might that be?" "Captain Michael Johnson," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the cockpit where Michael could be seen reviewing flight plans. The skepticism in Jennifer's expression deepened into something that made Sarah's stomach tighten with recognition. She had seen that look before, the subtle but unmistakable doubt that crossed people's faces when they couldn't quite believe that she belonged where she was. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and return to the gate while we sort this out. We can't have passengers occupying seats that aren't properly assigned to them." Emma looked between her mother and the flight attendant with confusion, her small hand reaching for Sarah's arm. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Sarah took a deep breath, drawing on every ounce of patience and dignity she possessed. "Emma, everything's fine, sweetheart. There's just been a misunderstanding." She looked back at Jennifer with steady eyes. "Ms. Williams, I understand you're trying to do your job, but I can assure you that we are exactly where we're supposed to be. Perhaps you could simply verify with Captain Johnson directly?" Jennifer's jaw tightened. The stress of her difficult morning, combined with her assumptions about who belonged in first class, had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. "I don't need to bother the captain with seating issues. That's my responsibility. I'm asking you politely to gather your things and return to the gate so we can resolve this without causing a scene." The conversation was beginning to attract attention from other first-class passengers who were glancing over with curiosity and concern. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, and the familiar weight of being the only black woman in a predominantly white space pressed down on her shoulders. "I'm not causing a scene," Sarah said quietly, her nurse's training helping her maintain a calm, professional tone, even as her heart rate increased. "I'm simply sitting in the seats that were assigned to my family. If you need verification, the gate agent can confirm our reservations, or you can check with your passenger manifest." Jennifer's voice grew louder, her stress and frustration boiling over. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I know when something doesn't look right. These seats are reserved for airline family members, and I need you to cooperate with my instructions." Emma began to whimper, frightened by the raised voices and the tension she could feel radiating from both adults. Sarah instinctively pulled her daughter closer, her protective instincts kicking in even as she struggled to process what was happening. "Mommy, I want to see Daddy," Emma said in a small voice. "In a minute, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, stroking Emma's hair while keeping her eyes fixed on Jennifer. "Ms. Williams, you are making my 3-year-old daughter upset over what you admit is a seating issue. I'm Captain Johnson's wife. These are our assigned seats, and I am not moving until someone with actual authority, not assumptions, tells me there's been a genuine error." The standoff had drawn the attention of several passengers, and Sarah could see some of them filming the interaction with their phones. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she refused to back down in the face of what she now clearly recognized as racial profiling. Jennifer, realizing that the situation was escalating beyond her control and that other passengers were watching, made a decision that would prove to be a career-defining mistake. "Security," she called toward the front of the plane, her voice carrying through the cabin. "I need assistance with a passenger who is refusing to cooperate with crew instructions." The word security sent a chill through the cabin, and several passengers began murmuring among themselves. Sarah felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, followed immediately by a surge of righteous anger. She had done nothing wrong, broken no rules, and caused no disturbance beyond the simple act of existing in a space where Jennifer Williams had decided she didn't belong. As she held Emma close and waited for whatever would happen next, Sarah couldn't help but think about all the conversations she and Michael had about raising their daughter in a world that might not always see her worth and value. She had hoped Emma wouldn't have to witness this kind of treatment until she was older and better equipped to understand it, but sometimes the world forced these lessons on children before their parents were ready to teach them. The atmosphere in first class had shifted dramatically from the peaceful boarding process to a tense standoff that had captured the attention of everyone in the forward section of the aircraft. Sarah could feel the weight of multiple gazes upon her, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the unfolding drama. She maintained her composure, but inside her heart was racing with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and protective fury for her daughter. Emma had begun to cry quietly, confused by the confrontation and frightened by the harsh tone in Jennifer's voice. Sarah gently rocked her daughter while whispering reassurances, but she could see the confusion and fear in Emma's eyes. This was supposed to be a special trip for Emma's birthday, a chance to visit Grandma and celebrate with family. Instead, it had become a nightmare scenario that Sarah had hoped her daughter would never have to witness. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's right here, and Daddy is just right there in the front of the plane," Sarah said softly, pointing toward the cockpit where Michael was still visible, though he hadn't yet noticed the commotion in the cabin. Jennifer Williams stood in the aisle, her face flushed with a combination of stress and stubbornness. The morning's cascading problems had reached a boiling point, and instead of stepping back to reassess the situation, she doubled down on her initial assumption. In her mind, she was protecting the integrity of the airline's policies and ensuring that first-class seats were only occupied by legitimate passengers. "Ma'am, I've called for assistance, and I need you to cooperate while we sort this out," Jennifer said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that brooked no argument. "This doesn't have to be difficult if you'll just work with me." Several passengers in nearby seats had pulled out their phones, and Sarah was acutely aware that this confrontation was likely being recorded. The thought of becoming the subject of viral social media videos added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. She had seen too many videos of black people being removed from planes, refused service, or questioned about their right to be in certain spaces. "I am working with you," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside her. "I have provided my boarding passes, I have explained who I am, and I have done nothing but sit quietly in my assigned seat with my daughter. What exactly do you need me to cooperate with?" Before Jennifer could respond, Tom Bradley, a businessman in seat 1C, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help but notice what's happening here. This lady hasn't done anything disruptive. She's just sitting with her little girl. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding that could be cleared up without all this drama?" Jennifer whipped around to face Tom, her patience completely depleted. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is a crew matter, and I need you to please mind your own business and prepare for departure." Tom's eyebrows rose at the sharp response, and he exchanged glances with his wife in the seat next to him. They had been frequent flyers for decades and had never witnessed a flight attendant behave so aggressively toward passengers who appeared to be doing nothing wrong. Dr. Patricia Adams, a retired professor sitting in seat 3A, also decided to speak. "Up. Young lady," she said, addressing Jennifer with the kind of firm authority that came from decades of commanding university classrooms, "I've been observing this interaction, and this mother and child have been nothing but polite and cooperative. Perhaps you should verify the seating arrangements more quietly instead of creating a public spectacle." The support from other passengers seemed to embolden Sarah, but it also appeared to further inflame Jennifer's determination to prove she was right. The flight attendant's face grew redder, and her voice took on a sharper edge. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to please stay in their seats and allow me to handle this situation. We have policies and procedures that must be followed, and I cannot allow unauthorized passengers to occupy premium seating." Emma's crying intensified, and Sarah felt her own composure beginning to crack. She had endured discrimination before, subtle and not-so-subtle incidents throughout her life that had taught her how to navigate spaces where her presence was questioned. But having her 3-year-old daughter witness and experience this, treatment felt like a violation of the safe bubble she and Michael had tried to create for their family. "Please stop yelling around my daughter," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new firmness. "She's frightened, and you're escalating a situation that could be resolved with a simple phone call to verify our reservation." Just then, Robert Chen, the Aistos Airlines customer service supervisor, appeared at the entrance to first class. He had been summoned by Jennifer's call for security and was clearly trying to assess the situation quickly. Robert was a veteran employee who had handled countless passenger disputes, and his trained eye immediately took in the scene. A well-dressed woman holding a crying toddler, a flight attendant who appeared agitated, and several other passengers, looking concerned and uncomfortable. "What seems to be the problem here?" Robert asked, his voice calm and professional. Jennifer immediately launched into her version of events. "This passenger is occupying seats reserved for the captain's family, and when I asked her to verify her tickets, she became uncooperative. I need these seats cleared so the actual reserved passengers can board." Robert looked at Sarah with a practiced, neutral expression. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding passes and identification, please?" Sarah handed over the documents, while Emma continued to cling to her, occasionally peeking out to look at the new person who had joined their conversation. Robert examined the boarding passes carefully, then looked at Sarah's driver's license. "Mrs. Johnson, I see here that you're booked in seats 2A and 2B, and your identification matches the reservation. Can you tell me who made this booking?" "My husband, Captain Michael Johnson," Sarah replied, gesturing again toward the cockpit. "He's the pilot for this flight." Robert's expression shifted slightly as he processed this information. He pulled out his tablet and began scrolling through the passenger manifest and crew assignments. The seconds ticked by in tense silence, broken only by Emma's occasional sniffles and the ambient sounds of the aircraft preparing for departure. As Robert continued his verification, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the bitter irony of the situation. Here she was, literally married to the man flying the plane, being questioned about her right to sit in first class. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so painful and embarrassing. The confrontation had now attracted the attention of passengers throughout the aircraft as word of the commotion had spread to economy class. Flight delays were common, but delays caused by passenger disputes in first class were unusual enough to generate significant curiosity and concern. Robert Chen had been with the airline for over 15 years, and in that time he had developed a keen ability to read situations quickly and accurately. As he scrolled through his tablet, cross-referencing passenger manifests with crew schedules, a clear picture began to emerge. His expression shifted from neutral professionalism to something approaching concern as he realized the magnitude of the mistake that was unfolding. "Mrs. Johnson," Robert said carefully, "I see here that Captain Michael Johnson did indeed make this reservation for his wife, Sarah Johnson, and daughter Emma Johnson. The seats are properly assigned, and there appears to be no issue with your booking." He looked up at Jennifer with the expression that conveyed both disappointment and the need for immediate damage control. Jennifer's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then a pale horror as the full implications of her actions began to sink in. She had not only wrongly accused a legitimate passenger, but she had done so to the captain's wife in front of other passengers while creating a scene that was undoubtedly being recorded on multiple phones. I don't understand," Jennifer stammered. "These seats are reserved for airline family members, and I thought—" "You thought what exactly?" Dr. Adams interjected from her seat, her voice carrying the sharp edge of academic precision. "You thought this well-dressed woman with valid boarding passes and identification somehow didn't belong in first class?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and several passengers shifted uncomfortably as the racial undertones of the situation became impossible to ignore. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion wash over her. Being proven right should have felt better than this. But the damage had already been done. Emma had been frightened, their peaceful trip had been disrupted, and Sarah had been subjected to the kind of public humiliation that would be difficult to forget. Robert, recognizing that the situation required immediate and careful handling, addressed Jennifer in a low but firm voice. "Ms. Williams, I need you to return to your duties and prepare the cabin for departure. We'll discuss this matter further after we land." Jennifer's mouth opened as if she wanted to say something, perhaps an apology or an explanation, but Robert's expression made it clear that she should retreat immediately. She nodded stiffly and began moving through the cabin, avoiding eye contact with Sarah and the other passengers who were still watching the aftermath of the confrontation. "Mrs. Johnson, on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for this misunderstanding," Robert said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "This should never have happened, and I assure you that we will be reviewing this incident thoroughly." Sarah adjusted Emma in her arms, feeling her daughter's body finally beginning to relax as the tension in the cabin decreased. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Chen, but I think my daughter and I would both benefit from speaking with my husband before this flight continues." Robert nodded immediately. "Of course. Would you like me to ask Captain Johnson to step back here for a moment?" Before Sarah could respond, Michael's voice came over the cabin intercom system for the routine pre-departure announcement. "Good. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Johnson speaking. We're currently preparing for our departure to Chicago, and we expect to be airborne in about 10 minutes. Flight time today will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes, and we're looking at clear skies and smooth flying conditions." The sound of her husband's calm, professional voice provided Sarah with a sense of comfort and stability that had been shattered by the confrontation. Several passengers glanced between the intercom speakers and Sarah, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place as they realized the full scope of what had just occurred. Tom Bradley leaned over toward his wife and whispered, "She's the pilot's wife. That flight attendant just accused the pilot's wife of not belonging in first class." His wife shook her head in dismay, and similar conversations began occurring throughout the cabin as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Michael's voice continued over the intercom. "We're going to go ahead and complete our final preparations for departure. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for takeoff." Robert looked at Sarah with a questioning expression. "Would you like me to have Captain Johnson come back now, or would you prefer to wait until after takeoff?" Sarah considered the options. Part of her wanted Michael to know immediately what had happened, but she also recognized that he had professional responsibilities that needed to be fulfilled. As the wife of a pilot, she understood that safety protocols and departure schedules took precedence over personal matters, even ones as significant as this. "After takeoff would be fine," Sarah said finally. "I know he needs to focus on getting us safely in the air." Emma had calmed down considerably and was now looking around the cabin with renewed curiosity. "Mommy, is Daddy still going to fly us?" "To Grandma's house." "Yes, sweetheart, Daddy is going to fly us to Grandma's house, and everything is going to be okay." Sarah smoothed Emma's hair and helped her get resettled in her seat. "Would you like to finish coloring your picture for Daddy?" As Emma returned to her coloring book, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the resilience of children. Emma had been frightened by the confrontation, but she was already beginning to recover, trusting in her parents' ability to make things right. Sarah wished she could bounce back as quickly from the emotional impact of what had just occurred. Dr. Adams caught Sarah's attention and smiled warmly. "Your little girl is beautiful, and you handled that situation with remarkable grace under pressure. I'm a retired professor, and I've seen my share of discrimination over the years. What happened to you was wrong, and I want you to know that there are witnesses here who will support your account of events if needed." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, and Sarah felt an unexpected surge of gratitude for these strangers who had spoken up on her behalf. In the midst of an experience that had highlighted the worst of human assumptions and prejudices, there had also been moments that demonstrated the best of human solidarity and support. Robert finished making notes on his tablet and looked at Sarah one more time. "Mrs. Johnson, I want you to know that this incident will be thoroughly investigated and appropriate action will be taken. We take these matters very seriously." As the aircraft began to push back from the gate and taxi toward the runway, Sarah settled back in her seat and tried to process everything that had happened. The confrontation had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it felt like it had changed something fundamental about this trip and perhaps about her family's relationship with the airline where Michael had built his career. Looking out the window, at the familiar sight of the airport operations, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how many other passengers had experienced similar treatment, and how many had not had the luxury of being married to the pilot to ultimately prove their right to be where they were. The Boeing 737 smoothly lifted off from the runway, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being pressed back into her seat as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude. Despite everything that had happened during boarding, she found herself taking comfort in the smooth, professional execution of the takeoff. Michael's expertise as a pilot had always made her feel safe during flights, and today that sense of security was especially welcome after the turbulent emotions of the past hour. Emma had her face pressed against the window, watching the ground fall away below them with the wonder that only a 3-year-old could possess. "Look, Mommy, the cars are getting tiny, and the houses look like my dollhouse." Sarah smiled, grateful that Emma seemed to have moved past the frightening confrontation and was now focused on the magic of flight. Children's ability to live in the present moment was something Sarah envied, especially when her own mind kept replaying the incident with Jennifer Williams. As they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers threw out. The cabin began to settle in for the flight to Chicago. The atmosphere in first class had returned to something approaching normal, though Sarah noticed that several passengers continued to glance in her direction with expressions of sympathy and solidarity. Tom Bradley unbuckled his seatbelt and approached Jim. Sarah's row. "Excuse me, Mrs. Johnson. I'm Tom Bradley, and this is my wife, Linda. We just wanted to say how sorry we are about what happened during boarding. That was completely unacceptable, and we want you to know that we're prepared to provide witness statements if needed." Linda nodded emphatically. "We've been flying for business for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You handled yourself with such dignity, and your little girl is just precious." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at their kindness. "Thank you both so much. That means more to me than you know. It's reassuring to know that there are people who will speak up when they see something wrong." Dr. Adams also made her way over from her seat. "As I mentioned earlier, I'm Patricia Adams, and I want to echo what Tom and Linda said. I spent 40 years in academia dealing with institutional bias, and what happened to you was a textbook example of racial profiling. I've already written down my contact information if you need witnesses for any formal complaint." The support from her fellow passengers was both heartening and sobering. Sarah appreciated their willingness to get involved, but it also underscored the reality that what had happened to her was significant enough to warrant witness statements and formal complaints. The incident wasn't just a minor misunderstanding that could be brushed aside. It was something that would likely have consequences. About 30 minutes into the flight, Robert Chen approached Sarah's seat with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Johnson, Captain Johnson asked me to let you know that he'd like to speak with you and Emma as soon as it's convenient. He can step away from the cockpit briefly now that we're at cruising altitude." Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension about telling Michael what had happened. She knew he would be furious about the way she and Emma had been treated, and she worried about how it might affect his relationship with the airline where he had built his career. "Emma, sweetheart, Daddy wants to say hello. Should we go see him?" Emma's eyes lit up with excitement. "Yes, I want to show Daddy my picture." They made their way to the front of the cabin, where Michael emerged from the cockpit with his co-pilot, James Rodriguez, temporarily taking over flight operations. The moment Michael saw Sarah's face, his expression shifted from professional calm to immediate concern. "Sarah, what's wrong? Robert said there was some kind of issue during boarding." Sarah glanced around at the other passengers and crew members, who were within earshot, then looked back at Michael. "Maybe we could talk privately for a few minutes?" Michael guided them into the small galley area near the cockpit, where they could have a relatively private conversation. Emma immediately wrapped her arms around her father's legs, chattering excitedly about the view from the airplane window and her coloring project. "Daddy, look! I colored the airplane picture for you." Emma held up her coloring book, showing a somewhat abstract but enthusiastic rendering of an aircraft in purple and green crayons. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." "I love it." Michael lifted Emma up and gave her a hug, but his eyes remained focused on Sarah's face. "Now, can you color another picture for me while Mommy and Daddy talk for a minute?" He set Emma down with her coloring book near the galley counter, then turned to Sarah with an expression of growing concern. "What happened?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the boarding process. She kept her voice low and calm, partly to avoid upsetting Emma, and partly because she was still processing her own emotions about the incident. As she described Jennifer's accusations, demands that she leave first class, and the public confrontation that followed, she watched Michael's face grow increasingly dark with anger. "She called security on you? She accused you of not belonging in seats that I specifically reserved for my family?" Michael's voice was barely controlled, and Sarah could see the muscle in his jaw twitching, a sign that he was furious but trying to contain it. "Michael, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but please don't do anything that could jeopardize your position with the airline. We can handle this through proper channels after we land." Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Sarah recognized as his way of trying to calm down when he was overwhelmed with emotion. "Sarah, do you understand what this means? One of my crew members racially profiled my wife and daughter, created a public scene, and called security, all because she decided you didn't look like you belonged in first class. This isn't just a customer service issue. This is discrimination, and it happened to my family on my flight." The conversation was interrupted by James Rodriguez's voice over the intercom. "Captain Johnson, we need you back in the cockpit for a radio communication from air traffic control." Michael looked torn between his professional responsibilities and his desire to address the situation immediately. Sarah could see him struggling with the competing demands of being a pilot and being a husband and father. "Go," Sarah said firmly. "We can talk more about this after we land. Emma and I are safe, and the immediate situation has been resolved. Focus on flying the plane." Michael kissed both Sarah and Emma, then returned to the cockpit with obvious reluctance. Sarah could see through the open cockpit door as he put his headset back on and resumed his professional demeanor, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during takeoff. As they returned to their seats, Emma chattering happily about seeing Daddy and showing him her picture, Sarah couldn't help but think about the broader implications of what had happened. This incident would likely affect Michael's working relationships with the cabin crew, create potential complications with his employer, and possibly become a public relations nightmare for the airline if the passenger videos found their way onto social media. But more than that, it had shattered something precious about their family's sense of security and belonging. Flying had always been a source of joy and adventure for them, a symbol of Michael's professional success and their family's prosperity. Now it would forever be associated with the memory of Emma crying while a flight attendant questioned their right to be there. Looking out the window at the clouds below, Sarah wondered how she would explain this experience to Emma when she was old enough to understand the full implications of what had happened. How do you tell a child that some people might question her worth or belonging based on the color of her skin? How do you prepare a daughter for a world that might not always recognize her value and dignity? These were conversations Sarah and Michael had always known they would need to have with Emma, but they had hoped to have them on their own terms and timeline, not in the aftermath of a public humiliation that had left their 3-year-old daughter frightened and confused. The remainder of the flight to Chicago provided an opportunity for Sarah to process the morning's events and consider the various ways the situation might unfold after they landed. Emma had fallen asleep in her seat, exhausted by the emotionally upheaval of the boarding process and lulled by the steady hum of the aircraft engines. Sarah found herself staring out the window at the patchwork of farmland below, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Dr. Adams approached Sarah's seat during the flight, moving carefully so as not to wake Emma. "May I sit with you for a few minutes?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded, grateful for the company and the distraction from her churning thoughts. "I wanted to share something with you," Dr. Adams said, settling into the empty seat across the aisle. "I'm retired now, but I spent my career as a professor of sociology, focusing on institutional racism and social justice. What happened to you today wasn't just one person's bad judgment. It was a manifestation of systemic biases that are deeply embedded in our society." Sarah listened carefully, appreciating the academic perspective on what she had experienced. Emotionally, the assumption that you didn't belong in first class, despite having valid tickets and identification, reflects implicit biases about who we expect to see in premium spaces. The fact that your husband is literally the pilot of this aircraft makes the irony almost absurd, but it also highlights how pervasive these assumptions can be. "I've experienced things like this before," Sarah said quietly, "but never in front of my daughter and never this publicly. I keep thinking about what Emma will remember from this and what it teaches her about the world." Dr. Adams nodded thoughtfully. "Children are remarkably resilient, but they're also incredibly perceptive. Emma will remember that her mother handled a difficult situation with grace and dignity, and that other people stood up to support what was right. Those are valuable lessons, even if they come from difficult circumstances." Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away. "I just never wanted her to have to learn these lessons so young. Michael and I have tried to create a safe bubble for her, where she could just be a child without having to worry about whether people would accept her or question her worth. Unfortunately, the world has a way of intruding on the bubbles we try to create for our children," Dr. Adams said gently. "But the strength and dignity you showed today will serve as a model for Emma when she faces her own challenges. She saw her mother stand up for herself with quiet courage, and she saw strangers become allies when injustice occurred. Those are powerful lessons about resilience and community." Their conversation was interrupted by Jennifer Williams, who appeared hesitantly at the edge of their row. Her earlier confidence and authority had been replaced by an obvious discomfort and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Mrs. Johnson," Jennifer said quietly, "I was wondering if I could speak with you for a moment." Sarah looked at Dr. Adams, who discreetly returned to her own seat to give them privacy. Sarah gestured for Jennifer to sit down, curious about what the flight attendant had to say. Jennifer sat on the edge of the seat, her posture tense and uncomfortable. "I want to apologize for what happened during boarding. I made assumptions that were wrong, and I handled the situation poorly. I let my stress from this morning affect my judgment, and there's no excuse for that." Sarah studied Jennifer's face, trying to gauge the sincerity of her apology. "Ms. Williams, I appreciate that you're apologizing, but I need you to understand that what happened wasn't just poor customer service or a mistake. You assumed I didn't belong in first class despite having valid tickets, and when I tried to explain who I was, you escalated the situation instead of simply verifying the facts. Jennifer nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I know. I've been replaying it in my mind since it happened, and I'm horrified by my own behavior. I've never done anything like that before, and I don't know what came over me. The stress of a difficult morning doesn't explain why you looked at me and my daughter and decided we were the problem, Sarah said firmly, but not unkindly. I've had difficult mornings too, but I've never questioned someone's right to exist in a space because of how they looked. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications of Sarah's words. You're right, she said. Finally, I can't blame stress for what was really a prejudice I didn't even realize I carried. I saw you and Emma, and instead of seeing passengers with valid tickets, I saw people who didn't fit my unconscious expectations about who belongs in first class. The honesty of Jennifer's response surprised Sarah. She had expected either defensive justifications or hollow corporate-speak apologies. Instead, Jennifer seemed to be genuinely grappling with the reality of her own biases. What happens now? Sarah asked. How do I know that the next black family who boards your flight won't face the same treatment? Jennifer took a shaky breath. I don't know how to answer that except to say that this experience has forced me to confront something about myself that I never wanted to acknowledge. I'm going to seek training, counseling, whatever it takes to make sure this never happens again, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences my actions deserve. Emma stirred in her sleep, and both women instinctively lowered their voices. Sarah looked at her daughter's peaceful face and felt a surge of protective love. Emma deserved to grow up in a world where her humanity was never questioned, where her right to exist in any space was never challenged based on the color of her skin. Ms. Williams, I want to believe that you're sincere about changing, but my concern isn't just about you. It's about the systems and cultures that allowed this to happen in the first place. How many other passengers have experienced similar treatment and didn't have a pilot for a husband to validate their right to be here? The question hung in the air between them, and Jennifer seemed to shrink under its weight. I don't know, she admitted, but you're right to be concerned about that. This can't just be about me learning to do better. It has to be about changing the culture that made my behavior possible. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement from Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing. Jennifer stood up, still looking deeply shaken by the conversation. Mrs. Johnson, I know my apology can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that it's sincere, and I want you to know that I support whatever action you decide to take regarding this incident. As Jennifer returned to her duties preparing the cabin for landing, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was glad that Jennifer seemed to understand the gravity of what had occurred, but she also recognized that individual awareness wasn't enough to address systemic problems. Dr. Adams returned to sit with Sarah as the plane descended through the clouds toward Chicago. How did that conversation go? Better than I expected, Sarah admitted. She seems genuinely remorseful and willing to acknowledge that this was about more than just a bad morning. But I keep thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't been the pilot's wife, or if there hadn't been passengers willing to speak up on my behalf. That's exactly the right question to be asking, Dr. Adams said. Individual transformation is important, but systemic change requires addressing the broader patterns and structures that make these incidents possible. As the Chicago skyline came into view outside the aircraft windows, Sarah reflected on how different this trip had become from what she had envisioned when they boarded that morning. Instead of a simple family visit to celebrate Emma's birthday, it had become a pivotal moment that would likely have far-reaching consequences for their family, Jennifer Williams, and potentially the airline industry. Emma began to wake up as The plane descended, rubbing her eyes and looking around with the disorientation that comes from napping during travel. "Mommy, are we almost at Grandma's house?" "Almost, sweetheart. Daddy is landing the plane now, and then we'll see Grandma very soon." As they prepared for landing, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what kind of reception would be waiting for them on the ground, and what the next chapters of this story would look like. The Boeing 737 touched down smoothly at O'Hare International Airport, and Sarah felt the familiar deceleration as Michael applied the brakes and reversed thrust to bring the aircraft to taxi speed. Emma pressed her face to the window with renewed excitement, pointing out the other airplanes and ground vehicles moving around the busy airport. "Look, Mommy, there's another big airplane just like Daddy's." "I see it, sweetheart. Chicago is a very busy airport with lots of airplanes." As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Sarah noticed several airport security vehicles and what appeared to be airline management personnel waiting on the ground. Her stomach tightened with apprehension as she realized that the incident from earlier was likely going to extend well beyond the flight itself. Robert Chen appeared at her seat again, this time accompanied by a woman in a business suit whom Sarah didn't recognize. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Lisa Martinez, our Regional Customer Service Director. She flew in specifically to meet with you when we landed." Lisa Martinez extended her hand with a professional but warm smile. "Mrs. Johnson, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced on this flight today. We take incidents like this extremely seriously, and I'm here to ensure that we address this situation appropriately and completely." Sarah shook Lisa's hand while keeping one arm around Emma, who was beginning to sense the adult tension again. "I appreciate that, Ms. Martinez. I hope this means the airline is prepared to take meaningful action, not just offer apologies." "Absolutely. We have several things we'd like to discuss with you, and I'd also like to speak with the witnesses to get their accounts of what happened. Would you be willing to meet with me after you've had a chance to deplane and collect your belongings?" Before Sarah could respond, Michael's voice came over the intercom for his post-flight announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare. Local time is 11:45 a.m. and the temperature is a comfortable 72 degrees. Thank you for flying with us today, and we hope you have a pleasant stay in Chicago or a smooth connection to your final destination." The announcement concluded, and within moments Michael appeared from the cockpit, still in his captain's uniform, but with an expression that barely contained his anger about the morning's events. He immediately went to Sarah and Emma, giving them both hugs while his eyes scanned the faces of the airline personnel surrounding them. "Captain Johnson," Lisa Martinez said, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa Martinez, Regional Customer Service Director. I'm here to discuss the incident that occurred during boarding this morning." Michael shook her hand, but his expression remained stern. "Ms. Martinez, what happened to my wife and daughter today is completely unacceptable. I've been flying for this airline for 15 years, and I've never been more disappointed in my colleagues or my employer." "I understand your anger, Captain Johnson, and it's completely justified. We're committed to conducting a thorough investigation and taking appropriate action." Dr. Adams approached the group, having gathered her belongings and prepared to deplane. "Excuse me, but I want to make sure you have my contact information as a witness to what occurred today." She handed Lisa Martinez a business card. "What happened to Mrs. Johnson was unconscionable, and I want to be sure my account of events is included in whatever investigation you conduct." Tom and Linda Bradley also joined the conversation, along with several other first-class passengers who wanted to provide witness statements. The scene near the front of the aircraft had become a gathering of people unified in their support for Sarah and their condemnation of Jennifer Williams's behavior. Emma, overwhelmed by all the adult attention, and serious conversations began to get fussy. "Mommy, I want to go see Grandma now. When are we going to Grandma's house?" Sarah lifted Emma up, feeling the weight of her daughter's confusion and her own emotional exhaustion. "Soon, baby. These nice people are trying to help us, and then we'll go see Grandma." Michael looked at his family, then back at Lisa Martinez. Ms. Martinez, my wife and daughter have been through enough today. Whatever discussions we need to have about this incident can happen after they've had a chance to recover from what was supposed to be a pleasant family trip. Of course, Captain Johnson, we can arrange to meet later today or tomorrow, whatever works best for your family's schedule. As passengers began deplaning, Sarah found herself surrounded by supportive fellow travelers who continued to express their outrage about the incident and their admiration for how she had handled the situation. Several people asked if they could exchange contact information in case their witness testimony was needed for any legal proceedings. Jennifer Williams appeared hesitantly at the edge of the group, clearly wanting to speak with Sarah again, but uncertain whether her presence would be welcome. She had been crying, and her earlier professional composure had been completely replaced by obvious distress. Lisa Martinez noticed Jennifer and gestured for her to join the conversation. Ms. Williams, as we discussed, you'll be meeting with Human Resources and Management this afternoon to provide your account of this morning's events. Jennifer nodded, then looked directly at Sarah. Mrs. Johnson, I know I already apologized, but I want you to know that I've been thinking about what you said during our conversation on the plane. You were right to point out that this wasn't just about my stress level. It was about biases I didn't want to acknowledge. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences result from my actions. Michael's jaw tightened as he heard Jennifer's words, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain his professional composure. Ms. Williams, he said finally, you questioned my wife's right to sit in first class on my own flight. You made my 3-year-old daughter cry because you decided they didn't belong where I specifically reserved seats for them. Whatever consequences you face aren't nearly as important as the impact your actions had on my family. The weight of Michael's words seemed to hit Jennifer like a physical blow, and she began crying again. Captain Johnson, I know there's no excuse for what I did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just want you and Mrs. Johnson to know that this experience has changed me, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Lisa Martinez stepped in to manage the increasingly emotional situation. I think we should continue these discussions in a more private setting. Mrs. Johnson, Captain Johnson, would you be comfortable meeting with me tomorrow morning to discuss how we're going to address this incident? Sarah looked at Michael, then back at Lisa. Ms. Martinez, before we agree to any meetings, I want to know what concrete steps the airline is prepared to take. This can't just be about disciplining one employee. It has to be about examining the culture and policies that made this incident possible. I completely agree, Mrs. Johnson. We're looking at this as an opportunity to review our training protocols, examine our corporate culture, and implement changes that will prevent similar incidents from occurring. Your experience is going to drive meaningful reform within our organization. As the group began to disperse and passengers finished deplaning, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The incident had been traumatic and humiliating, but the response from fellow passengers, airline management, and even Jennifer Williams herself suggested that something positive might come from their ordeal. Emma had fallen asleep in Sarah's arms during the conversations, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the day. As they prepared to leave the aircraft and head to baggage claim, Sarah looked out the window at the Chicago skyline and thought about how different this arrival was from what she had anticipated when they boarded that morning. The story was far from over, and Sarah knew that the decisions she and Michael made in the coming days would have implications not just for their own family, but potentially for countless other travelers who might face similar discrimination in the future. Michael's mother, Dorothy Johnson, lived in a comfortable suburban home about 30 minutes from O'Hare Airport. She had been eagerly anticipating Emma's birthday visit for weeks, preparing the guest room with fresh flowers and stocking the kitchen with all of Emma's favorite foods. When Sarah called to give her a brief overview of the morning's events, Dorothy's grandmother instincts immediately kicked into protective mode. "You bring that baby straight here," Dorothy had said firmly. Over the phone. "Whatever happened on that airplane can be dealt with later. Right now, Emma needs some normalcy and love." The taxi ride from the airport gave Sarah and Michael their first opportunity to talk privately about the incident and its potential consequences. Emma dozed in Sarah's lap, finally peaceful after the emotional turmoil of the morning. "I keep replaying it in my mind," Sarah said quietly. "The look on Jennifer's face when she decided I didn't belong there, the way she escalated instead of simply checking her passenger manifest, the fear in Emma's eyes when she called security." Michael reached over and took Sarah's free hand. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I'm sorry Emma had to see that. And I'm furious that it happened on my flight, with my crew, to my family. What are you thinking about the meeting tomorrow with Lisa Martinez?" Michael was quiet for a moment, watching the Chicago suburbs pass by outside the taxi window. "I'm thinking that this is bigger than just one incident. If Jennifer Williams could look at you and immediately assume you didn't belong in first class, despite having valid tickets and identification, then there's something systemic that needs to be addressed." Dr. Adams said something similar on the plane. She thinks this could be an opportunity to push for real change, not just individual consequences. "What do you want to happen, Sarah? How do you want this to be resolved?" It was a question Sarah had been pondering since the incident occurred. Part of her wanted Jennifer Williams fired and publicly humiliated, wanted the airline to face significant consequences for allowing such discrimination to occur. But another part of her recognized that meaningful change required more nuanced solutions. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to other families," Sarah said finally. "I want the airline to examine their training, their policies, their culture. And I want Jennifer Williams to become part of the solution, not just a scapegoat." When they arrived at Dorothy's house, Emma immediately perked up at the sight of her grandmother waiting on the front porch with arms wide open. Dorothy Johnson was a retired elementary school teacher with the kind of warm, enveloping presence that made children feel instantly safe and loved. "There's my birthday girl," Dorothy called out as Emma ran toward her. "Grandma has been waiting all morning to give you the biggest hug." As Emma disappeared into Dorothy's embrace, chattering excitedly about the airplane and her coloring book, Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to release. This was what the trip was supposed to be about: family, love, and celebration. Dorothy looked at Sarah and Michael with concern. "How are you both holding up? You sounded pretty shaken up on the phone." "We're managing, Mom," Michael said, giving his mother a hug. "It was a rough morning, but we're here now, and that's what matters." Over lunch, while Emma played with toys Dorothy had purchased for the visit, Sarah and Michael filled Dorothy in on the details of the incident. Dorothy listened with the kind of focused attention that came from decades of dealing with children's problems and finding constructive solutions. "So this flight attendant looked at my beautiful daughter-in-law and granddaughter and decided they didn't belong in first class?" Dorothy's voice carried a quiet anger that Sarah had rarely heard from her normally gentle mother-in-law. "That's essentially what happened," Sarah confirmed. "Despite having valid tickets, despite my identification matching the reservation, despite the fact that Michael had personally made the booking." Dorothy shook her head slowly. "Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry you and Emma had to experience that, but I'm proud of how you handled yourself. Emma is going to remember that her mama stood up for what was right with dignity and courage." That afternoon, while Emma napped and Michael returned some business calls, Sarah and Dorothy sat on the back porch drinking tea and talking about the broader implications of the morning's events. "You know," Dorothy said thoughtfully, "when Michael was growing up, I used to worry about the challenges he might face as a black man in aviation. It was such a white-dominated field, and there weren't many role models who looked like him. How did you handle those worries?" "I taught him to be excellent at everything he did, to conduct himself with integrity and professionalism, and to never let anyone make him feel like he didn't belong anywhere he had earned the right to be." Dorothy smiled. It looks like he passed those lessons on to you. Sometimes I wonder if being excellent and professional and dignified is enough, Sarah said. I did everything right today, and it still happened. Oh, honey, it's never been about being enough. Racism isn't a problem that gets solved by the people who experience it being more perfect. It gets solved when the people who perpetrate it decide to change. Their conversation was interrupted by Michael's phone ringing. He answered it in the kitchen, and Sarah could hear his professional tone shift to something more personal and intense. That was Lisa Martinez, Michael said, when he rejoined them on the porch. She wants to know if we'd be willing to meet with the airline's CEO tomorrow in addition to our scheduled meeting with her. Apparently, word about the incident has reached the executive level. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Meeting with the CEO suggested that the airline was taking the incident seriously at the highest levels, but it also raised the stakes considerably for whatever resolution they might reach. What did you tell her? I told her we'd discuss it and get back to her tonight. Sarah, this could be an opportunity to push for real systemic changes, but it also means we're going to be under a lot more scrutiny. Dorothy looked between her son and daughter-in-law with the wisdom that came from 7 decades of navigating a complex world. What does your gut tell you about what you want to accomplish here? Sarah considered the question carefully. I want Emma to grow up in a world where her humanity is never questioned based on her appearance. I want other families to never experience what we went through today. And I want the people responsible for creating change to understand that this isn't just about customer service, it's about human dignity. Then it sounds like you know what you need to do, Dorothy said simply. That evening, after Emma had been thoroughly spoiled by her grandmother and had fallen asleep surrounded by new toys and books, Sarah and Michael called Lisa Martinez to confirm their willingness to meet with the airline's senior leadership. We want to be clear about our expectations, Sarah said during the call. This can't just be about apologies and compensation. We're looking for concrete commitments to policy, changes, training reforms, and ongoing accountability measures. I understand completely, Mrs. Johnson, Lisa replied. The CEO is prepared to discuss substantial changes to how we address bias and discrimination within our organization. Your experience is going to drive meaningful reform. As they ended the call and prepared for bed in Dorothy's guest room, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension about the next day's meetings. The incident had been painful and humiliating, but it had also created an opportunity to potentially prevent similar experiences for countless other families. Looking at Emma sleeping peacefully between them, Sarah was reminded of what was really at stake in these conversations. It wasn't just about justice for what had happened to them. It was about creating a better world for their daughter and all the children who would grow up after her. The airline's corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago occupied an entire floor of a gleaming office tower with conference rooms that offered panoramic views of the city and Lake Michigan. Sarah had dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a navy blue business suit that projected both professionalism and authority. Michael wore his dress uniform, a subtle reminder of his 15-year career with the airline and his standing as one of their senior pilots. Emma was spending the day with Dorothy, who had planned a trip to the Children's Museum and lunch at Emma's favorite restaurant. Before leaving for the meeting, Emma had given both her parents tight hugs and made them promise to come back with good news about the airplane lady. The executive conference room was more crowded than Sarah had expected. In addition to Lisa Martinez, there was CEO Richard Thompson, Chief Operating Officer Janet Stevens, Head of Human Resources Mark Wilson, and General Counsel Patricia Lee. The presence of the legal team suggested that the airline was taking the potential ramifications of the incident very seriously. Richard Thompson, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and a demeanor that projected both authority and concern, stood to greet them as they entered. Captain Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, thank you for coming in today. I want to begin by offering my personal apology for what you experienced yesterday. What happened to your family was completely unacceptable and contrary to everything we stand for as a company. Sarah appreciated the apology, but she had learned to be wary of corporate expressions of regret that weren't backed up by concrete action. Mr. Thompson, we appreciate your apology, but we're more interested in discussing what changes you're prepared to implement to ensure this doesn't happen to other families. That's exactly why we're here, Thompson replied, gesturing for everyone, to take seats around the large conference table. We've spent the last 18 hours reviewing our policies, training protocols, and corporate culture, and we've identified several areas where immediate changes need to be made. Mark Wilson opened a folder and began outlining the airline's preliminary response plan. First, we're implementing mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, with annual refresher courses and accountability measures. Second, we're revising our customer service protocols to include specific procedures for handling situations where passengers' right to be in premium cabins is questioned. What kind of accountability measures? Michael asked, his pilot's attention to detail evident in his focused questions. Janet Stevens answered, employee performance reviews will include specific assessments of cultural competency and bias awareness. Incidents like what happened yesterday will result in immediate suspension pending investigation, and repeat offenses will result in termination. Patricia Lee, the general counsel, leaned forward. We're also implementing a robust reporting system for discrimination incidents, with independent oversight and regular audits to ensure these policies are being followed consistently across all of our operations. Sarah listened to the proposals with a mixture of appreciation and skepticism. The changes sounded comprehensive, but she had heard similar promises from other organizations that had faced discrimination scandals, and she knew that implementation was often more challenging than policy creation. These all sound like positive steps, Sarah said, but I have some specific questions about implementation and follow-through. How will you measure the effectiveness of bias training? How will you ensure that employees actually change their behavior, not just complete training? Modules? Thompson nodded appreciatively. Those are exactly the right questions to be asking. We're partnering with external diversity and inclusion consultants who specialize in measuring behavioral change, not just training completion. We'll have quarterly assessments and we'll publish annual reports on our progress. What about Jennifer Williams specifically? Michael asked. What consequences is she facing for her actions? Mark Wilson exchanged glances with Thompson before answering. Ms. Williams has been suspended pending the completion of our investigation. However, we're also considering a restorative justice approach that would involve her participating in additional training and potentially becoming part of our diversity education program. Sarah was surprised by this response. She had expected Jennifer to be fired immediately, and the suggestion that she might become part of the solution was both intriguing and concerning. Can you elaborate on what you mean by a restorative justice approach? Lisa Martinez answered. Ms. Williams has expressed genuine remorse for her actions and has requested the opportunity to make amends. We're exploring the possibility of having her share her experience as part of our training program, helping other employees understand how unconscious bias can lead to discriminatory behavior. You want the person who discriminated against my family to become a trainer? Michael's voice carried a sharp edge of disbelief. Thompson raised his hand in a calming gesture. Captain Johnson, I understand your reaction, and we would only move forward with this approach if you and Mrs. Johnson were comfortable with it. The decision about Ms. Williams's future with the company is ultimately yours to make. The offer gave Sarah pause. Part of her wanted Jennifer fired and publicly humiliated, but another part recognized that having someone who had experienced the consequences of bias speak authentically about change might be more effective than simply removing her from the equation. "I'd want to speak with Ms. Williams directly before making that decision," Sarah said finally, "and I'd want concrete assurances about how her participation in training would be structured and supervised." "Of course," Thompson agreed. "We can arrange for you to meet with her this afternoon if you're interested." The meeting continued for another hour, covering details about compensation for Sarah's family, ongoing monitoring of the airline's diversity initiatives, and Sarah's potential involvement in reviewing and improving their training programs. By the time they concluded, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic that the airline was committed to meaningful change rather than just damage control. As they prepared to leave, Thompson made one final offer. "Mrs. Johnson, we'd like to invite you to join our newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. Your perspective and experience would be invaluable in helping us create lasting change." Sarah looked at Michael, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll consider it, Mr. Thompson, but I want to be clear that I'm not interested in being a token appointment. If I join your board, it will be with the expectation that my recommendations will be implemented, not just discussed. You have my word on that," Thompson replied. As they left the corporate headquarters and walked back toward their rental car, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but cautiously hopeful. The airline's response had exceeded her expectations in many ways, but she knew that the real test would be in implementation and follow-through. "What are you thinking?" Michael asked as they sat in the car before driving back to his mother's house. "I'm thinking that maybe something positive can come from what happened to us," Sarah said. "But I'm also thinking that we need to stay involved to make sure these promises become reality." They had one more meeting scheduled for that afternoon, a conversation with Jennifer Williams that would determine whether redemption and education could triumph over punishment and retribution. It was a decision that would define not just Jennifer's future, but the kind of change that their family's painful experience might create. The afternoon meeting with Jennifer Williams took place in a small conference room at the airline's training facility, a more intimate setting than the corporate boardroom where they had met with senior management. Lisa Martinez was present as a facilitator, but the focus was on allowing Sarah and Jennifer to have an honest conversation about what had happened and what might come next. Jennifer arrived looking nervous and contrite, dressed professionally but without the authoritative demeanor she had displayed during the flight. Her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she had been crying, and her hands trembled slightly as she took her seat across from Sarah and Michael. "Mrs. Johnson, Captain Johnson," Jennifer began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking non-stop about what happened yesterday, and I've come to understand that my apology on the plane wasn't enough. What I did to you and Emma was wrong on every level, and I need you to know that I take full responsibility for my actions." Sarah studied Jennifer's face, looking for signs of sincerity versus calculated remorse. "Ms. Williams, I appreciate that. You're taking responsibility, but I need to understand what you've learned from this experience. What do you think really happened yesterday?" Jennifer took a shaky breath before responding. "I think I looked at you and Emma and made assumptions, based on racial bias that I didn't want to acknowledge I had. I told myself it was about verifying tickets and following procedures, but the truth is that I questioned your right to be in first class because you didn't match my unconscious expectations about who belongs in premium seating." Michael leaned forward slightly. "And what made you realize that, honestly?" "It was the conversation with Mrs. Johnson on the plane. When she asked me how she could be sure the next black family wouldn't face the same treatment, I realized that my behavior wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a pattern of bias that could affect any family who didn't look like what I expected." Sarah felt a grudging respect for Jennifer's honesty, even as the pain of the incident remained fresh. "The airline has proposed that you might become part of their diversity training program, sharing your experience to help other employees recognize their own biases. How do you feel about that? Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Johnson, if you're willing to give me that opportunity, I would consider it a privilege. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I know I can't undo the pain I caused you and Emma, but if sharing my experience could prevent even one other family from going through what you went through, then maybe something positive could come from my terrible mistake. What would that look like? Michael asked, his tone still skeptical, but less hostile than earlier. Lisa Martinez interjected to explain the proposed program. We're developing a comprehensive bias awareness curriculum that would include video testimonials from employees who have experienced unconscious bias, as well as from individuals who have been affected by discriminatory behavior. Ms. Williams would participate in both the development and delivery of this training, always under supervision and with ongoing coaching. Sarah considered the proposal carefully. The idea of Jennifer Williams becoming an advocate for change rather than simply a cautionary tale appealed to her sense of justice. But she wanted to be sure that the program would be substantive rather than performative. Ms. Williams, if you participate in this program, you'll be admitting publicly that you engaged in racial discrimination. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny and the impact it might have on your career and reputation? Jennifer nodded without hesitation. Mrs. Johnson, my reputation should reflect what I did. If admitting my mistakes publicly can help create change, then that's what I should do. I've already talked to my family about this, and they support whatever consequences I need to face. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering details about how the training program would work, what Jennifer's role would be, and what ongoing accountability measures would be in place. By the end of the meeting, Sarah felt that Jennifer's remorse was genuine and that her participation in the diversity program might indeed create positive change. As they prepared to leave, Jennifer made one final request. Mrs. Johnson, I know this is asking a lot, but would it be possible for me to apologize to Emma directly? I keep thinking about how frightened she was, and I want her to know that what happened wasn't her fault. Sarah was touched by the request, recognizing that Jennifer understood the impact her actions had had on a 3-year-old child. I'll think about it, Ms. Williams. If we arrange something like that, it would need to be in a comfortable setting for Emma, and it would need to be focused on helping her understand that she did nothing wrong. When they returned to Dorothy's house that evening, Emma was full of stories about her day at the museum and eager to show her parents the souvenirs Dorothy had purchased for her. The contrast between Emma's joy and innocence and the serious adult conversations about discrimination and consequences was stark but also hopeful. Over dinner, Dorothy listened as Sarah and Michael described their meetings with airline executives and Jennifer Williams. Her perspective as an educator and grandmother provided valuable insights into how the changes might affect other families and children. It sounds like you've turned a terrible experience into an opportunity for real change, Dorothy said. Emma may not understand it now, but someday she'll be proud that her parents stood up for what was right and helped make things better for other children. That night, as they tucked Emma into bed, she surprised them with a question that showed how much she had absorbed despite her young age. Mommy, is the airplane lady going to be nicer to other kids now? Sarah sat on the edge of Emma's bed and smoothed her daughter's hair. Yes, sweetheart. She's going to learn how to be kinder and help teach other people to be kind too. That's good, Emma said sleepily. Everyone should be nice to kids on airplanes. 3 months later, Sarah received an email from Lisa Martinez with a video link to the airline's first bias awareness training session. The video showed Jennifer Williams speaking to a room full of flight attendants about her experience and the lessons she had learned. She spoke with obvious emotion about the fear in Emma's eyes and the dignity with which Sarah had handled the situation. I want every person in this room to understand that unconscious bias isn't just a concept we discuss in training, Jennifer said in the video. It's something that can cause real harm to real families if we don't examine our assumptions and change our behavior. Sarah watched the entire training session, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. The incident had been painful and traumatic, but it had also created meaningful change that would benefit countless other families. 6 months after the incident, Sarah accepted the position on the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. Her first initiative was to implement a passenger feedback system specifically designed to identify and address discrimination incidents before they escalated. The system had already prevented several situations similar to what her family had experienced. Michael continued his career with the airline, but now served as a mentor for pilots from underrepresented backgrounds and spoke regularly at aviation diversity conferences. His perspective as both a senior pilot and someone whose family had experienced discrimination provided a unique voice in industry discussions about inclusion. Jennifer Williams completed her probationary period and became one of the airline's most effective diversity trainers. She never forgot the lesson learned from that difficult morning, and her authentic testimony helped hundreds of employees recognize and address their own unconscious biases. She had also personally apologized to Emma during a carefully arranged meeting at Dorothy's house, where she explained in age-appropriate terms that she had made a mistake and was working to do better. Emma, now 4 years old, had no lasting trauma from the incident. She remembered it as the day the airplane lady was sad and had to learn to be nicer. Her resilience and ability to move forward with innocence intact reminded Sarah daily of why the fight for change was so important. The airline's bias incident reports dropped by 78% in the year following the implementation of their new training program. Customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers increased significantly, and the company became a case study for other airlines looking to address systemic discrimination. On Emma's 4th birthday, exactly 1 year after the incident, the Johnson family took another flight to visit Dorothy. This time, they were greeted by a diverse crew that had all been through the enhanced diversity training program. The flight attendant, a young black woman named Ashley Thompson, made a point of welcoming Emma aboard with a special birthday sticker and wings pin. "Is this your first flight, sweetie?" Ashley asked Emma with genuine warmth. "No, my daddy flies the airplane," Emma replied proudly, pointing toward the cockpit where Michael was completing his pre-flight preparations. "Your daddy. Is Captain Johnson? He's one of the best pilots we have." Ashley's eyes lit up with recognition and respect. As Sarah watched the interaction, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was the world she had fought to create for Emma, one where her daughter would be welcomed and celebrated, not questioned or diminished. During the flight, Sarah received a text message from Dr. Patricia Adams, who had become a friend and advisor in the months following their shared experience. The message included a photo from a diversity conference where Patricia was presenting their story as a case study in successful conflict resolution and systemic change. "Your courage changed more than just one airline," the message read. "The ripple effects are being felt across the industry. Emma's generation will fly in a more inclusive sky because of what you did." As the plane reached cruising altitude and Emma settled in to color a new picture for her grandmother, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The incident that had begun as a nightmare had ultimately become a catalyst for positive change that would benefit thousands of families. Looking out the window at the clouds below, Sarah thought about the metaphor of flying, how it required both the courage to leave the ground and the skill to navigate through turbulence to reach a destination. Her family's experience had been turbulent, but they had navigated through it with grace and determination, ultimately reaching a place of healing and hope. Jennifer Williams, now a senior diversity trainer, was scheduled to speak at a national conference the following month about the transformation that was possible when people took responsibility for their mistakes and committed to genuine change. She often ended her presentations with a photo of Emma coloring on an airplane, explaining how the innocence and resilience of a 3-year-old had taught her more about humanity than years of corporate training ever could. Michael announced over the intercom that they were beginning their descent into Chicago, and Emma pressed her face to the window with the same excitement she had shown on that first flight a year ago. But this time, there was no tension, no confrontation, no tears. Only the joy of a family traveling together with the confidence that they belonged wherever their journey took them. As they prepared for landing, Sarah squeezed Michael's hand and smiled at Emma, who was chattering excitedly about showing her latest artwork to Grandma Dorothy. The incident that had threatened to traumatize their family had instead strengthened their bonds and amplified their voices in the fight for justice and equality. The airplane touched down smoothly in Chicago, and as they taxied to the gate, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the difficult journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and hope. Emma would grow up in a world that was more just and inclusive because her parents had refused to accept discrimination and had instead chosen to transform pain into progress. Walking through the terminal toward baggage claim, Emma skipping between her parents with unbridled joy, Sarah knew that they had not just survived their ordeal, they had triumphed over it, creating lasting change that would benefit countless families for years to come. The story that had begun with tears and injustice had ended with transformation and hope, proving that even the most painful experiences could become catalysts for positive change when met with courage, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And high above the clouds in aircraft around the world, families of all backgrounds were flying with greater confidence and dignity because one mother had refused to accept that her daughter didn't belong wherever love and determination had earned them the right to be.